Welcome to Trading Strategy.ai, the podcast where you can learn more about essentials of DeFi trading in new world. This is your go-to show for automatic trading strategies and market insights. Welcome to the conversation, and this is your host, Nadia. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. Different from previous conversation, this time we have two guests, Deo and Dan from YieldNest Finance. Welcome, guys.
Thank you for having us here. We're happy to be here and excited to get this conversation going.
Likewise, thanks for having us over.
I'd love to hear more about you guys. What's your background and how did you end up working in crypto industry?
First time I heard about crypto was like 2010, 2011, like a long time ago. Obviously, back then I was still a student and tried to experiment with it. Didn't fully understand it, but got a little bit. And actually in 2025, 26, I joined crypto more full time. I was a IT consultant. My background is also in computer science and economics. And I was like, wow, this is great because crypto is kind of like finance and IT combined. So very quickly, I quit my IT consultancy job, which I was doing at the time in the Netherlands. And I started working for a crypto fund. And that's how I got started. And from there, I always got a lot of interest and passion for decentralized finance, which I think is very important for the world, and that we create systems that we can actually organize ourselves in more decentralized ways. Yeah, and that really motivated me to keep working in the industry throughout all the craziness that we're going through right now and have been going through. And then instead of just having a more traditional fund structure, together with Dan, we started YieldNest, which now offers like just similar to what other crypto funds would offer, but on-chain in vaults. That's now all fully live. I have a passion for DeFi, and I still think it's very early days and a lot of work to do still. So yeah, exciting.
In my case, I think it was pretty early in college when I started getting bothered by this trend that we noticed in software related to the client server model and how most services online get very centralized. And you would look at Google and Facebook and Amazon and all these platforms that essentially control all your data. Execution of code is on their side. So you just have to trust everything and that nothing bad ever happens, which seemed like a poor model for basically what are basic internet services, and that eventually it would lead to some kind of censorship or some kind of top-down control. And I was fascinated with like simple protocols that weren't even money-based, like BitTorrent. And then I wanted to get into the crypto industry, but at that stage was probably 2014, 15. You really had just the exchanges that were hiring people and maybe a couple protocols here and there. And I started working on some private blockchain projects around 2018 that were Ethereum based, and then got a great chance to work in DeFi in 2020 on the Nexus Mutual protocol and built that out to a 9-figure TVL. And that was really exciting because it was DeFi summer. So it was probably the most rapid growth that DeFi ever experienced since we started. And I've been staying with the ecosystem ever since and launched YieldNest in 2024. We've been going strong with that one, more focused on the yield side of things. And yeah, pretty cool products. We started out with restaking and we hit 9-figure TVL with YieldNest as well. And now we're focusing more on generalized yield generating vaults for ETH and USD, and with our latest vault focused on RWAs.
About YieldNest Finance, you'd like to know more about that venture and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, day to day on my side, it's more of a focus on technology. So you could say it's a CTO role. Realistically, we've been managing a team of different sizes and building out the YieldNest protocol and a front end that users can interact with it. And that means building out smart contract systems that need to secure 9 figures or more in value and upgrading those. So we went with a more product focused mindset in, where we have to update our product and protocol over time to match market needs, which worked well. And yeah, day to day, mostly focused on that, and also just general strategic movements in terms of vault management for our top vaults, and making sure yield is maximized, risk is minimized, and so on. And yeah, being very hands-on with the on-chain protocol, basically, in terms of building.
I'm mostly involved in everything, also in the technical side, but also all on the operational side. DeFi is maturing and moving more into like always different lanes. So my background is also more on the research and analytics side. So that's also what I bring to the YieldNest. Overall partnerships, integrations, making sure that all our assets are working properly, and trying to think about what's the next wave in DeFi and how can YieldNest play a role in that, and how can we make sure that all our vaults are safe and operational.
When I was trying to schedule our meeting, you mentioned several times the word asset, DeFi, and DeFi fusion. I want to know what are your opinions on this?
Yeah, so I think what we're facing right now, we first always had in the early days of DeFi, like 2019, when it still was kind of called open finance. We already saw RWAs, right? I always made the joke, I refused to get excited a fifth time for RWAs because we've been there many times of, hey, the herd is coming, the institutions are coming. My opinion in that is that it doesn't really matter. And I think us as an industry, we built amazing infrastructure to build new financial or vault products to coordinate and find new decentralized structures of forming capital or coordinating around the shared goal. I think it's early days for the RWA side, but we've been there from the beginning. There was like, oh, now we get a Uniswap pool, or we get CDP, collateralized debt positions on MakerDAO, or we have a curve pool or lending markets. How are we going to use that? Well, in the beginning, it was always kind of like crypto assets. Where's the real yield coming from? Well, in the beginning, we had a lot of, remember the DeFi summer days where there was a bunch of protocols pooping out shitcoins where everybody was kind of farming around. That caused a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily say like real value creation, but it created at least some money flows and APYs on chain. And that persisted for some time. But then we had this big crash in DeFi, similar to what we're going through right now. And I think what's important for the decentralized ecosystem and for our industry is that we do find a way to bring real world assets, uncorrelated yields on chain, and get it live and integrated in DeFi, and not only rely on token incentives or token emissions, because that is kind of ending. You need real productive capital on chain that pays out different layers of the stack. And I think that's what we also have been focusing on. The only challenge there is that DeFi is always used to getting instant redeemable assets. So it's very normal in DeFi that you deposit a token and withdraw it at the different blocks, like within 10 seconds, basically, right? But that's impossible if you want to have productive capital. So we're trying to crack the nut of duration assets, and we do that with buffers and different techniques that we can zoom in more. But I think it's really important for DeFi and for our industry to become more and more useful for the world, to get real productive assets on chain and integrate that in the amazing DeFi infrastructure that we have today.
I think those are all true things, and it's very well said. What I would probably add to that is RWAs, I think, are part of fulfilling the promise of just the crypto industry building out essentially a settlement layer for the financial world in a different, transparent way, one that prioritizes the user more in terms of creating bearer assets and yielding the control back to the user and giving more power back to the investor. So I think it's absolutely key that we do lock in certain ways of doing things, like permissionless, non-KYC, maximizing the liberty that participants in the market have in these products. And we'll see how it actually plays out. We've focused primarily on yield on private credit, which we can cover a little bit later. But essentially, it does give you this stable value share in a vault that accrues yield over time, which is great. Other people are tackling, let's say, the price exposure, or potentially, who knows, maybe you even get some form of bearer asset for owning stocks at some point in the future. We focus on this because I think it's just the most accepted model and the most attractive in terms of risk and returns. And additionally, I think one thing we need to highlight is beyond just the great programmatic qualities and interoperability of the DeFi market, where you get these components that you can string together and combine lending markets with pools and get this really fast flowing financial ecosystem that's transparent. You get outworks and it's composable. We probably have a great opportunity here to offer access to yield sources globally that otherwise you would never be able to tap into, or it would be very difficult, because you're essentially facing hurdles like, I'm not citizen of X country. I don't have access to this particular business network. I don't have this particular score with this bank or financial institution. Therefore, I have no sort of access to that particular opportunity at all. And that's what actually we've been doing with our RWA asset. We've opened up a investment opportunity that would be basically impossible to access for the probably over 99% of people on the planet. So I think there's a great opportunity in that. That's just not just blockchain focused, but it's enabled by our way of doing things.
I am more curious on the liquid asset that you guys are building with YieldNest.
Basically, YieldNest started with liquid restaking tokens, like now over like 2.5, 3 years ago. That was kind of like the first step into building a yield aggregator, right? And then with YieldNest, we build our own vault architecture that makes it possible for us to create our own vaults with our own like control over it and our own parameters. And we know exactly all the ins and outs of that architecture. So that's kind of the first step that we took some time ago. And from there, we created multiple vaults and are now focused on 3 vaults. So Wine USDX, Wine ETHX, and Wine RWX. And those 3 vaults are currently, there's a USDC yield from 5 to 15%. There's an ETH yield from 3, 4 to like 6, 7%. And there's the RWA vault with a fixed percent APY, but with a 1-year maturity. So there's like these 3 assets that we are currently having live, and those assets we're building out. Currently, it's kind of a hard time in the DeFi markets in terms of the liquidity. ETH price has taken quite a beating. So the vaults are quite in a defensive mode at the moment. And once the market cools down, more like buffer liquidity or more redemptions will flow in. So it's a bit of a different kind of vault structure and architecture than other people have, but it gives higher yield and it's able to integrate anywhere in DeFi. Yeah, maybe Dan also wants to say something about the vault architecture that we built.
Yeah, that was a good explanation. What I'd add is we started out feeling a need for an evolution of the vault architecture, since there was a premium type of implementation built by Yearn and variations of that for these instant deposit and withdrawal vaults that followed the ERC 466 standard. And that was very good, and they did a great job in a lot of ways. But essentially, the adaptation that we have to face now is that we're dealing with duration vaults that have to impose some kind of restrictions in terms of withdrawals and redemption times. So that is the new adaptation here. And what we've also dealt with in practice is the need to manage multiple assets in one vault in a very easy, seamless way. So we've kind of built our vault architecture with these things in mind, while still not running too far away from standards. So if you look at our vaults, they still look a lot like a 4626 and even have a buffer to offer users limited withdrawal capability within the size of the buffer. But in addition to that, they do have to have all these extra features. So it's like a supercharged 466. We call it the Max Vault. And it can hold and price multiple assets in terms of a base asset, which is great for this price stable type of vault that you want to build. Say you have a YieldNest and it's denominated in ETH and keeps accruing value in that. And we found this framework very reusable, and base vault is extremely reusable. And it allows us to build our system and adapt to new things quickly. So it was pretty easy to get RWA vaults going and all sorts of other things. So it's a great framework for that.
Considering the current market conditions, besides the pullouts on breaches hacks, what do you think are the next steps that the industry need to take to get in a better position?
Yeah, I think that is the big question, right? Like we're having basically like a constant fight against the attackers and the defenders. And I think what we need to do is get our shit together and knock on wood, but YieldNest has operated very well. We didn't have any major issues around security so far, so good. And we do that by having many steps, like anything we deploy, so much like checks, and we have our own hacker swarm of agents that we use. So I think, unfortunately, in DeFi and crypto, it went from like, yes, security is very important. We need to spend a lot of time and money on it if you want to survive. Went through like, we need to spend more time and money on it. So it's unfortunate, but I do think the barrier to entry with these products has been gone up a little bit due to all the recent developments in AI and security that we're seeing right now. But at the same time, I do see a way forward, and I don't know how Dan agrees with that or not, but the best way forward I see from here is more formal verification. I'm very happy with our Max Vault design. It's very minimal, right? It's in coding, and in security is always less is more. So you kind of want to have very elegant, very low attack surface code and have it like little packages of information, isolated risk parameters, and very clearly defined components via, for example, systems or other mechanisms. I think that's where we need to go as an industry. This went up by AI, and I think we just need to learn how to operate in that new environment and not be too scared for it. I think a lot of times also there's a lot of like scare and like, oh, quantum and oh, like every protocol gets hacked. Yeah, it's true. But at the same time, there's also a lot of protocols that don't get hacked, right? So we need to get our shit together. We need to do more checks and try to stay ahead of the attackers.
And if I may add to that, it probably takes everything we've got in terms of solving this problem. So stacking multiple types of solutions. And yeah, Deo mentioned formal verification. That's already employed by a lot of protocols. And I think that's a practice that we want to make it an industry norm at some point. And I think DeFi still needs some type of insurance layer at some level. So that needs to come in, and it needs to be more standardized. There's obviously a lot of protocols and companies that try to tackle that problem as well, and still looking for the perfect solution. And it's got to take some time to get there. I think we need to lean heavily into LLMs for this. And they're massively overhyped for sure in a lot of industries, and there's got to be some displacement of jobs and things like that. But aside from those narratives, realistically, the attackers got empowered momentarily a lot because their job is basically to find vulnerabilities and exploit them. The job of builders is to build and then secure the system. So there's more effort related on the side of the builders. So well, we need to lean into that heavily because you need to counterattack that. And I think they do open up the opportunity of not only finding vulnerabilities, but also surfacing all the details of a particular project or system much more detail, because we used to do these risk reports. We've also done a bunch of collaborations with the Llama Risk team, and Amadeo was a founder of that. And I think what LLMs enable is basically doing that in a much more rapid and up-to-date fashion, because we should have the ability to scan protocols and quickly update and compute what's the status of that in terms of access control, in terms of upgrades, in terms of parameter changes, and be able to flag anything that is looking strange or poorly configured or like a security risk. So, for example, if we take the recent issue that was related to layer 0, you can imagine that, just imagine that you had the system that if you're trying to deposit into that protocol that had the issue or Aave itself, you would get this report that essentially zooms in and flags that across the stack, there's this particular weak point here, where, for example, you have a poorly configured validator set, or in the case of layer 0, we knew that that particular bridge was misconfigured. And you could get these in detail reports. That's what LLMs are good for, like processing a lot of data and flagging certain things. So I think there's a lot of ground to cover there. And I think we need to take a approach where we use all of these solutions together and stack them. So obviously the classic audits, I think they're still important. And then you can have the automated audits that use LLMs. Then I think you can have these supervision systems and risk report systems that analyze the whole stack, because the big problem with DeFi is that a lot of the protocols just stack onto each other and the risk compounds because of that stacking, but you don't have full visibility into what's the final outcome of that and how it changes over time, because not only do you have upgradable protocols that might introduce new problems on an upgrade, but you can also have changing parameters, or you have access control that may not be as solid. So for example, there's maybe an EOA that controls some kind of power in the system. That would be the worst situation. Or maybe there's a multi-sig that has a very low threshold. So we should be able to scan those in an ideal situation and flag all those issues, because some of them are indeed, I think, are pretty low-hanging fruit. And strengthening things such as oracles, there's a lot of ground to cover there as well, since even state-of-the-art protocols like Aave, which obviously they have good security practices and strong teams, but you can see like there's still a ton of improvement. For example, how oracles behave. We saw the incident with the Capel oracle, and we could definitely come up with better designs there. So I think combining multiple solutions will eventually get us there. I don't think it's as bearish as people say that this may not work in the end. I disagree with that, because in the end, you're compared relatively to trad finance, which is essentially not transparent. You always take counterparty risk, and there's no world where you have no risk. So it's always a question of like, is our solution and the trade-offs that we offer superior to what else you can get in the market?
Before we get back to the episode, if you are interested in getting access to over 25,000 DeFi Vault datasets, including performance and risk metrics, visit our website tradingstrategy.ai for free data and professional subscriptions. Now, let's get back to the episode. How can we use AI to stop optimizing for speed and instead build a high-quality, secure system required for a safe agent-to-agent economy?
Well, right now we're suffering, as Dan said, like from this thing that the attackers and defenders have AI, but it's now kind of code that was produced before you got all these crazy ultra AI tools. The attackers have a jump ahead because they can start to scan all the code and attack, where the defenders have to rescan all their code and go out all the code. And I think open source is probably going to be more resilient to this because there's more people that care. Closed source is going to have some issues there, in my opinion. So that's currently the biggest impact right now, is security and defense, and oh shit, how our attackers and defenders are going to use all these tooling. I think over time we will see more and more new kind of concepts of agent to agent economies, where I think the web and everything is going to be served differently. There's going to be a lot of more modular UI structures that are really tailor-based towards certain use cases or personalized for certain needs. And we are going to get, I think, more agent-to-agent communication, and also the X402 protocols. They're now not used at all. Like, everybody is like super bullish on it, but they're not used at all, because I think there's like a missing link there of actually making that stuff useful and finding, I'm not sure how that will look like, but there's going to be ways that people will figure out how to actually use that X402 protocols to do on-chain payments in agent-to-agent communications or agent-to-human communications, where if a human asks a question, it can pay agents, specialized agents, or specialized agents with still human control in the loop to do things. So I think that's kind of like the next frontier for agents, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I've outlined in my previous answer most of the points that I wanted to make on how I see AI playing out. And I think this is a great direction as well with regards to the agent economy. In the end, I think what we need to do is get it to a point where the probability of these kind of incidents is greatly reduced. So hacks and exploits. And there's also the insurance there that is well priced, that can catch the rest of the situations, so that investors just have clarity in terms of like, this is a low probability event, but if it happens, then there's this type of recourse and there's a way to recover the funds. So obviously there you can have structures as well which help with that. So junior senior tranching is one that we've obviously explored. So I think in the end, you cannot probably guarantee that a system will always be hackable, mostly because even if you prove the code correct, you can still have a operational failure of some point if the system allows flexibility, let's say in terms of an admin or just a manager, a curator of a vault doing certain actions, and that causing either a security vulnerability or some other kind of loss. So I think it's impossible to guarantee that, but we can reduce the probability of that and then add some kind of layer to insure the funds. And AI probably also just helps in terms of us covering some of this ground quicker, although it's not a magic bullet. And we can definitely not lean on what internet Twitter community calls vibe coding to do this, since what we realize is like for system software and critical execution paths, you cannot afford to have totally supervised AI building that. You can have it look for issues in that. But I think it does add a force multiplier to builders. So potentially things that didn't happen just because we do not have bandwidth as an industry, just taking the total amount of people working on these problems. We don't have the bandwidth to cover all the ground we want to cover. The force multiplier could allow for that. So you could have just more polish, essentially, because I think that's what LLMs add in the toolbox of a builder before you could deliver the products. Now, maybe it's not a question of delivering them much faster, but just delivering them with a much higher degree of quality. So I don't think it's just a matter of like shipping stuff quick, which is obviously a good objective, but we could shift that energy and say like, hey, we have more resources. Why don't we ship much, much higher quality stuff? Because to be honest, I think in general, software does have a quality problem. It's always had a quality problem. That's why we've always had bugs. And that's maybe the mindset shift there should be less of a mindset shift where we say that we want to ship things a lot quicker, but we want to use that extra power that we have that amplifier to actually ship much higher quality things. So that would be a good shift in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the past, if you built shitty software, it was like, okay, the hackers will not immediately find it. But now with all these toolings, like any mistake will just immediately be sniffed out.
So, which is more favorable for DeFi users long term? Fixed rate lending or variable rate lending?
I mean, this depends, right? With real world assets, most of the time have durations, right? Like it's very seldom that a real world asset has no durations, or it's just a stable coin, right? So with durations, and if you have the lending markets or you use it, I think variable rates make a little bit more sense, because if these markets are under stress, the people that are lending out the money should then earn from that, right? So I think fixed rate for lending is hard and variable for lending is better. I do think the other way around, for not only for lending, but just as an asset, I think we need more fixed rate income, like fixed income assets on chain. And that's also what we built with Y and RDX, which is giving a fixed 11% APY, fixed 11% coupon with a 1-year maturity. So that's a very predictable fixed yield instrument, which I think is very important. And I think it really depends per your use case, right? Because mostly fixed rates have lockups most of the time, I guess, and variable rates are more variable, more flexible. So it really depends what kind of structuring the end user does. And I think at the end of the day, it's always a combination of both is probably best.
And this will be the last question. What are some of the hard lessons you have learned so far in crypto?
Yeah, that's the big question. Let me try to keep that very short. I think what I learned mostly is that actually our industry is becoming more and more important, I would say, for our human progress. I would say if we're living in a world where all finances are capped and you need to prove that you're some sort of a LGBTQ friendly person in order to get your credit or something, that would be a horrible future to live in, right? So I hope that DeFi offers a way out. So the biggest lessons I learned is we are working on a big mission, and I think it's very important that we keep going and keep our values up. The other thing is that always security first, don't haste into things, and especially around certain duration structures or capital structures, always make sure to communicate and articulate very well expectations and mechanisms. That's really hard because the complexities in DeFi is really big. So if you need to explain all the little nuances, that's too much. So people need to do more of their own research before entering certain products. But overall, I think as an industry, we need to do a better job educating and winning back the trust in the decentralized markets over TradFi markets. And the biggest lesson overall is just there's no free lunch and there's no short-term gains. I have a long-term horizon, and I think that's important in crypto and DeFi, because if you go into crypto, think you can get rich quick, that's going to be a bit of a downer, because it's a lot of hard work. And I think that that's important, that if you want to enter in DeFi, if you want to enter in crypto, understand this is definitely a longer-term play. And if you don't have conviction, you're going to not survive it, right? Because in the first downtrend, like we see now, like ETH is almost below 1600, like crazy, right? If you don't have conviction or any other bigger reason to stay in this industry, you're not going to survive. So have conviction and have passion for what you do. I think that's the most important thing that I learned.
Yeah, I would say along these lines, just to double down on that, I think for a lot of the people that stick around, there's more than just a business opportunity. So I think that's true for our team and a lot of people that have been around for a long time building protocols. There's definitely this larger objective of seeing if we can shift the balance of power in general with regards to how finance works globally, and give more power back to individuals managing their own money. And this is not an easy task at all, since we often potentially do things that are similar to how the real financial system works, but we are, let's say, underpowered and just use these clever mechanisms to achieve our goals. So I agree. Yeah, that's one lesson that we need to learn, that we need to stick it out in the long term. And there's no guarantees. There's no guaranteed payoff at the end of this. So you have to aim and stick to what your goal is and assume that you might not see a payoff in the foreseeable future, or maybe never even that could happen. So that's kind of like a demoralizing thought in a way, but at the same time, I don't think there's any other way out of it. Otherwise, we're always going to be locked into KYC hell and just whatever the alternative is, which is a top-down control system. So if the objective is to achieve something other than that, it's not going to be a easy road. And some directions lead to dead ends for sure. But I do believe, like I said earlier, is that we are offering, let's say, this digital medium with really nice programmatic properties and immutable contracts and systems that offer bearer assets and properties that give you, let's say, tools against censorship, so make your transactions uncensorable. But I do think that we're also opening up opportunities in the real world that are otherwise inaccessible. And RWAs sound like they're not DeFi. And I guess they're not because the funds have to travel to investments outside of the chain. But in combination with DeFi, I think they will unlock a bunch of things. I think the other lesson is we're not just building this cool alternative to these old ways of doing things that the banks used, and it was slow, and now it's super fast and automated. But we also should be unlocking opportunities for people that were just completely inaccessible in the current system, either because you didn't have the right passport or you didn't have a physical location or the right connections and network. So we should be focusing on that as well and tie it to the global community as a whole. Like, can you actually bring value more than just, oh, this is like a nicer programmatic abstraction and it's much more efficient and so on? Can you actually unlock new opportunities for people to tap into and ideally earn a living and then be able to invest securely into all these opportunities and at some point sleep well at night, right? On their investments and not be so stressed out like they are currently. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you so much. Great insights, so far. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as I did. And anything else you want to tell our listeners?
It was a great interview and looking forward to do this again. In a better market, these things happen, and especially in these down markets, I think it's very important to look like people that are still listening to this podcast, people that are still active in the industry, look around, like who's actually building, who's actually active, because this is when you will see the real people
True.
that actually care about the industry and not just here for a quick buck, right?
Thank you again, guys.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.